All right, class, this is a short lecture on books 5 and 6 of the Aeneid, and today is February 15th, 2021. We're going to start with book 5, which is the funeral games for Anchises. And if you'll remember, you'll want to have your book with you as you listen to this lecture so that you can follow along. And this will help for your quizzes and just internalizing the book. So turn to the beginning of book 5, and it's the funeral games for Anchises, and the first 9 lines pick up as Aeneas is sailing away from Carthage, and he sees a strange sight in the distance. It says, "All the while Aeneas, steeled for a mid-sea passage, held the fleet on course, well on their way now, plowing the waves blown dark by a north wind. As he glanced back at the walls of Carthage, set aglow by the fires of tragic Dido's pyre. What could light such a conflagration? A mystery. But the Trojans know the pains of a great love defiled, and the lengths a woman driven mad can go, and it leads their hearts down ways of grim foreboding." So Aeneas looks back at Carthage, and he sees the smoke from Dido's pyre, and he doesn't know what it is exactly. He's not sure. But it fills the crew with a sense of grim foreboding that where they're going next and the things that are going to happen are probably not going to be good. Kind of the next main thing that happens is Palinurus, the pilot, is trying to guide the ship through a storm, and you kind of want to put a bookmark on his name because he comes back at the end of book 5. So we'll just kind of put a pause on Palinurus and then come back to him. They land on Sicily, which is the home of Anchises. That's how you say that name, Acestes. If you didn't look it up, it's Anchises. And so Sicily is the home of Anchises, and we find that that is where Anchises' bones are. If you remember, Anchises is Aeneas' father, and he died while they were going from place to place. And apparently Anchises was buried in Sicily, and so now they have gone back to Sicily, and they are going to hold funeral games there in Anchises' honor. Aeneas says that this would be an excellent time to hold funeral games in memory of his father, and as we talked about last week, this should bring to mind the funeral games for Patroclus toward the end of the Iliad, as well as the day of songs and contests in Phaeacia. And that is probably the one that is more in view here because, as we've said before, the first 6 books pattern after the Odyssey. And so it makes sense for the day of songs and contests in Phaeacia to be in Virgil's view as opposed to the funeral games for Patroclus. So they have most of the same contests as the other games. The first one is a ship race, and the names are kind of interesting. They have the names Dragon, Chimera, Centaur, and Scylla. And those are all 4 of those are the names of monsters. So the ships are represented by names of monsters. And the winner of the ship race is Cloanthus, and we're told that he wins because of a nicely timed prayer that he throws up as they get close to the finish. He says, "You gods, you lords of the waves, I'm racing over here. I'll gladly steady a pure white bull at your altars, there on shore, and pay my vows, scatter its innards over the salt swell, and tip out streams of wine." So he asks the lords of the sea to help him win the race, and he will offer a sacrifice in their honor, and they comply. They honor his prayer, and so Cloanthus is the winner, and that wraps up the ship race. And then the next thing is a foot race, and this begins on page 163, and it's very short. It ends on page 164, and there are 2 characters who are introduced who become important later in the book. They return in book 9 in a much more important capacity than they appear here in the funeral games, and those 2 are Nisus and Euryalus. And it says that they are very, very close friends. They have a great love of friendship. In C.S. Lewis's The 4 Loves, friendship is one of the 4 loves, and there's a very strong bond between Nisus and Euryalus. And in the race, Nisus slips. He slips on some slick blood and he falls. And to make sure that Euryalus, his close friend, wins, he tackles Salius and makes sure that Salius can't beat Euryalus, and so Euryalus wins. And so that's the winner part, but then you have a dispute. And Salius rightly says, I was cheated. I was winning and I was tackled. And so Aeneas, who is the gracious host of these funeral games, he gives a prize to Salius. He gives a giant African lion's hide, a great weight with its shaggy mane and gilded claws. And so, even though he doesn't win, Aeneas is gracious to him, gives him a prize. Well, then Nisus complains, and he says, well, if you're going to give prizes to those who don't win, I deserve a prize as well, because I was winning when I slipped. And you might think he has the lesser claim than Salius does, but Aeneas gives him a prize as well. And so it says, the fatherly captain smiled down at his friend and had them fetch a shield, did a man's work. The Greeks had torn from Neptune's sacred gate. This gleaming trophy he gives to the fine runner. So it's to show that Aeneas is a magnanimous host of these funeral games. And in that, he might remind us a little bit of Achilles, who is much more fun to be around at the funeral games for Patroclus than he is the whole rest of the book. And then there's the boxing, and Dares is out and he's ready to fight. And then there's an old fighter, an old boxer named Entellus. And Entellus has to be shamed by Anchises into getting into the ring and fighting with Dares. And it's interesting, on page 166, beginning at line 447, this should have reminded you something when you read this. So this is describing Entellus. Fighting words. Down in the ring he threw his pair of gauntlets, massive weights that violent Eryx used to sport. Binding his fists to fight with rawhide taut and tough, the crowd was dazed. 7 welted plies of enormous oxhide, stitched in ridges of leather and iron to make them stiff. Dares, dazed the most, shrinks back from the bout. But the hardy son of Anchises tests their heft, turning over and over the heavy coiling straps. Hopefully that reminded you of when Odysseus, in disguise, was going to fight Iris, or Aeneas. He mainly goes by Iris. And as soon as Odysseus strips down to get ready to the fight, they notice his rippling thighs and his biceps and his girth, his muscle. And Iris starts to shrink back. He's no longer very confident about fighting the old beggar. And you kind of see that happening here as Entellus gets ready to fight. Dares begins to shrink back. But Entellus clearly wins. The fight is stopped. Aeneas doesn't want Dares to be terribly injured or killed. And so Aeneas stops the fight, but it's pretty clear that Entellus wins. Dares will appear later in kind of the major battle toward the end of the book. And he gets killed toward the end of the book. And then lastly, we have the archery contest. And there's a reference in the archery contest to Pandarus on page 169. And if you remember, Pandarus is the one who broke the truce between the Greeks and the Trojans in Book 4 of the Iliad after Athena tricked him into taking a shot at Menelaus. And so he's referenced here because it's an archery contest. And Eurytion hits the dove. That's the goal of the contest, is to hit the dove. And so it seems that Anchises can't possibly win, but when Anchises fires his arrow, it ignites into flame. And so he's deemed the winner because of kind of the supernatural aspect of that feat. And that wraps up the funeral games for Anchises, but it doesn't wrap up this particular book, Book 5, because Juno is brought into the picture. Again, it often happens that when everything is going well, then the gods come and interfere and they change the complexion of what's going on. And so Juno speeds Iris down, and Iris appears in the form of one of the women in Aeneas's company. And she begins to stir up the other women to where they're in a kind of a frenzy, kind of a panicked frenzy, and they end up burning the ships. They start setting fire to the ships. And this is a major problem because if the ships are burned, then they're marooned here in Sicily. And that's what Juno wants. She doesn't want them to make their way to Italy or to Latium. And so they're able to save the ships. Not all the ships are lost. And they recognize that a god is impersonating Beroe, the one who riled up the women. And so Aeneas assesses and talks to Anchises, and they decide, well, the women are going to have to stay in Sicily. They're not able to continue on to found the new Troy. They are going to have to stay with Anchises in Sicily while they go on. And as you get to the very end of Book 5, remember they're in Sicily. This is where Anchises' bones were buried. And Anchises' phantom comes and visits Aeneas. This is one of now probably the third time that Aeneas has been visited by a phantom. He was visited by Hector. He was visited by Creusa. And now he's visited by Anchises' phantom. And Anchises says that he is waiting to speak with Aeneas in the house of death. Which I've always kind of wondered, well, why doesn't Anchises just speak to him now since he's a phantom? And it doesn't seem like he has anywhere else he has to be. Why doesn't he just talk to Aeneas now? But Aeneas has to go to the house of death. And in part, that's because it's part of Virgil's way of showing that Aeneas is superior to Odysseus in every respect. And so just as Odysseus had to go to the house of death, Aeneas is also going to go to the house of death with a different experience than the one that Odysseus had. And the last thing that happens in the book is that Palinurus, who opened the book trying to pilot the ship in a storm, it closes with his death where he falls off the side of the ship and he drowns, he dies, and nobody knows it, and they won't discover it until they're in the house of death, which should remind us of in the Odyssey when Elpenor falls off the roof of Circe's house and breaks his neck, and when they go to the house of death, there's Elpenor, and they have to go back and they have to bury him. So that's the end of Book 5, and it's not one of the most important books in the Aeneid, but you do see a little bit more of Aeneas' leadership and the respect that his men have for him and how he handles conflict. And then the probably the main thing is Anchises telling him that he needs to go to the house of death after the ships have largely been burned. So that takes us to Book 6, The Kingdom of the Dead. And Aeneas encounters the Sibyl, and her name is not Sybil, it's the Sibyl. A Sibyl is a seer, and she does not want to have anything to do with Aeneas, and she tries to pitch the word from Apollo away from her. She doesn't want to give a prophecy to Aeneas, and it's only after a great effort that she is subdued, and she delivers her message. This is on page 185, beginning at line 100. The Sibyl says, "You who have braved the terrors of the sea, though worse remain on land, you Trojans will reach Lavinium's realm. Lift that care from your hearts, but you will rue your arrival. Wars, horrendous wars, and the Tiber foaming with tides of blood, I see it all. Simois, Xanthus, a Greek camp, you'll never lack them here. Already a new Achilles springs to life in Latium, son of a goddess too. Nor will Juno ever fail to harry the Trojan race. And all the while pleading, pressed by need, what tribes, what towns of Italy won't beg you for help? And the cause of this new Trojan grief? Again, a stranger bride, a marriage with a stranger once again. But never bow to suffering. Go and face it, all the bolder wherever fortune clears the way. Your path to safety will open first from where you least expect it, a city built by the Greeks." So a couple of important things in there. She says that you've braved the sea, but worse terrors remain on land. They will reach Lavinium's shores, but they will rue their arrival. And so this is a foreshadowing, as she says, of war to come, wars, horrendous wars. And it's foreshadowing the Trojans' upcoming fight with those who will follow Turnus. And we'll talk more about Turnus next week after we talk about books 7 and 8. But Turnus becomes the main antagonist to Aeneas in the second half of the book. when we get into the Iliad part of the book. And that's why it says, already a new Achilles springs to life in Latium. Well, this is Turnus. He's the new Achilles. And the cause is a stranger bride. And it doesn't mean in the sense that she's strange. It means that she is foreign, or that she is not a Trojan. And we'll find out that Lavinia has a fate upon her life that she is to marry a foreigner. She is not to marry a Latin. And this is going to be a problem because Turnus wants to marry her, and she wants to marry Turnus, and her mother wants her to marry Turnus. Everything should be good except for this fate that says that Lavinia is supposed to marry a foreigner. And so when Aeneas comes to Latium, he is the foreigner who is to marry Lavinia. And he is the only one who likes the arrangement. That and the king, his name is Latium. He likes the idea because he is pious and he wants to honor the gods. But nobody else likes the arrangement, and that's why war is going to break out rather early in Book 7. Aeneas, in the kingdom of death, asks to see his waiting father, but the Sibyl says that he can't and he has to wait. She says, this is on page 186, the descent to the underworld is easy. Night and day the gates of shadowy death stand open wide. But to retrace your steps, to climb back to the upper air, there the struggle, the labor lies. So it's easy to get into the house of death, but it's not easy to get back out. And so he has to do some things first. Aeneas has to first perform two tasks. The first is to bury Maecenas, and the second is to obtain a golden bow, which he can give to Charon, who is the one who will ferry them across further into the underworld. And if you may be familiar with Charon, he's the ferryman across the river Styx. You'll see him again when you read the Divine Comedy by Dante over the summer. Again, we talked about Palinurus. He fell off the ship and he drowned and nobody knew it, and that's why he's on Acheron's shores, and he will be there until his body is buried or until something is done for him, and that's why he's on Acheron's shores. Aeneas descends further as the book goes on, and in lines 321 and 3 to 331, he's menaced by monsters. It says, there in the midst a giant shadowy elm tree spreads her ancient branching arms, home, they say, to swarms of false dreams, one clinging tight under each leaf, and a throng of monsters too. What brutal forms are stabled at the gates, centaurs, mongrel Scyllas, part women, part beasts, and 100-handed Briareus, and the savage Hydra of Lerna, that hissing horror, the Chimera armed with torches, Gorgons, Harpies, and triple-bodied Geryon, his great ghost. And here, instantly struck with terror, Aeneas grips his sword and offers its naked edge against them as they come. And if his experienced comrade had not warned him, they are mere disembodied creatures, flimsy will-o'-the-wisps that flit like living forms. He would have rushed them all, slashed through empty phantoms with his blade. So he's terrified of these monsters that are menacing him, but they're really just disembodied spirits. They can't really hurt him. And even so, he would have attacked them even though they were monsters, and there were many of them. And you might notice, too, that a couple of those, the centaurs, the Scyllas, the Chimera, those were all ships that raced during the funeral games of Anchises. We've talked about harpies before. The 100-handed Briareus is one of the monsters that is briefly mentioned in the Iliad. And so, anyway, it's meant to show Aeneas' great bravery. As Aeneas goes further, he sees Dido among the suicides, and he tries to talk with her. I'll find that section. He says, this is on page 197, beginning at line 528. So he sees her, recognizes that she must be dead because her ghost or her shade is down in the house of death. And he says, tragic Dido, so was the story true that came my way? I heard that you were dead. You took the final measure with a sword. Oh, dear God, was it I who caused your death? I swear by the stars, by the powers on high, whatever faith one swears by here in the depths of earth. I left your shores, my queen, against my will. Yes, the will of the gods, that drives me through the shadows now. These moldering places so forlorn, this deep unfathomed night, their decrees have forced me on. Nor did I ever dream my leaving could have brought you so much grief. Stay a moment, don't withdraw from my sight. Running away, from whom? This is the last word that fate allows me to say to you, the last. Aeneas, with such appeals, with welling tears, tried to soothe her rage, her wild, fiery glance, but she, her eyes fixed on the ground, turned away, her features no more moved by his pleas as he talked on, than if she were set in stony flint or Parian marble rock. And at last she tears herself away, his enemy forever, fleeing back to the shadowed forests, where Zacchaeus, her husband long ago, answers all her anguish, meets her love with love. So she will not speak to him, much like Ajax would not speak to Odysseus, and she retreats. There's a reunion with Zacchaeus, her former husband, but it doesn't appear that it makes her any happier. Again, in the house of death, it appears that those who are there are no longer able to change or mature or change their outlook on things. They're only able to kind of replay the past over and over again, which would be hell. And that's the experience that she seems to have. There's kind of a funny dig at Homer or at the Greek commanders by Virgil. Aeneas sees the Greek commanders. He sees Agamemnon and some of the others. It says, let's see. But the Greek commanders and Agamemnon's troops in phalanx, spotting the hero and his armor glinting through the shadows, blinding panic grips them. Some turn tail and run, as they once ran back to the ships. Some strain to raise a battle cry, a thin wisp of a cry that mocks their gaping jaws. So Virgil is kind of making fun of the Greeks. Agamemnon and these others see Aeneas and they all run. They all run away in terror, even though they're dead and he can't really do anything to them. On the verge of Tartarus, which is kind of deepest hell in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, Aeneas is not allowed to go in. The Sibyl says that he is too pure, and so she tells him a lot of the tortures that are going on in there, but he can't see them for himself, which again is elevating him above Odysseus, because if you remember, Odysseus did go in and he did see the many tortures that had befallen the Titans, the earlier race of gods who are down there. And so Aeneas is not allowed to go in because he is pure, and Odysseus, by contrast, was not. He does finally get to Elysium, which is kind of a paradise or a heaven in the house of death. That's where Anchises is. And Aeneas sees a river and he sees these second bodies, and it's kind of confusing. There's not a whole lot that you need to know about it, but the waters of the river Lethe cause you to forget your past life, and it's one of the four major rivers in the underworld, and it's the only one that is actually, I guess, good in a sense. And the dead souls are washed in the forgetful waters of Lethe after 1,000 years, and then they can again assume a body. So it's kind of touching into reincarnation a little bit. Again, this is not Christian literature, but that's what's going on there, that you see these souls kind of being reborn into new bodies after 1,000 years. And then Anchises goes through the line of Aeneas' descendants, and we kind of saw this in Book 1, where Jove was recounting to Venus Aeneas' line, and you kind of see it again. These are some of the famous men of Rome. If you happen to do the Memoria Press curriculum when you were in grade school, you might have done the famous men of Rome curriculum. A lot of these men are here in this list at the end of Book 6. And so that wraps up the first half of the Aeneid and wraps up the Odyssey part. As we get into Books 7 and 8, you will see a very quick turn toward things that come out of the Iliad. You see a lot more fighting. You see the wars being drawn up. You see a list of those who are going to fight in the wars, like you saw in Book 2 of the Iliad. And so you'll recognize the profound shift between the first 6 and the second 6 books. So that wraps up this week's lecture, and I will put class information, things related to assignments, in the email.